Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Okay, welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. Healthcare. Healthcare is, let's face it, healthcare is a global crisis at this point. We have seen how people can very easily fall through the cracks globally, going with the pandemic. We've seen there are still countries that still have yet to get the proper tools that are needed to even combat COVID-19. It is a global crisis that needs to be addressed on a global level. But first we need to focus on what's going on at home. And here in Canada, the premiers of Canada have come together as a united group to talk about healthcare. They also were talking about energy security and how there's a need for that also. But first, let's focus on healthcare and how many people are falling through the cracks with different levels of healthcare, whether it be something as simple as the stuffy and sniffling nose, to mental health, where people are dying from overdoses because of addictions. It is all about health care. It is all about developing a system where people don't fall through the cracks, developing a system that people feel safe with going to in order to get healthy, stay healthy, to move beyond being sick, to move beyond developing symptoms. Ensuring that when we do have symptoms, that we have a place to go where those symptoms will be addressed, the root cause dug out, and we'll return to a healthy state. And that is what the premiers across Canada have come together to discuss, that there's a shortage of doctors, there's a shortage of healthcare workers, and the system isn't always accessible to everyone. And that's what should be happening, is it should be accessible to everyone equally across Canada, within the provinces, the municipalities, as well as when we look out again globally. The healthcare should be a right, and a right that is well protected through all the different levels of government and systems, both locally, nationally, provincially, and globally. So let's listen to what four of the premiers have to say as they were seated on the east coast of Canada in one of the Atlantic provinces.
Oh, the good thing is that we are approaching the end of August. Yeah. Anything you want me to say?
I don't don't have a specific question. I know. What's your hope the takeaway will be? Actually, I do have a question. What's your takeaway for today that you want the council to think about?
Well, we all know the world is facing so many problems, challenges, and we are all crying for peace, stability, security. And then what will be the way out? Definitely for us, we do believe that through the crisis we are facing, the Ukraine crisis, the other relevant crisis, we have to reflect. And the relevant parties have to draw lessons. And then, well, concerning the way forward, it's our firm belief that we have to tell ourselves clearly that we have only one world. We have a shared future. We have, hi, good morning, Rosemary. We have a common security. We have a common development. Only based on the common future, common security, common development, and then we are able to coexist peacefully and in a prosperous way. All the security of all countries are indivisible, and we have to realize that no one can really survive its own security at the expenses of others. And definitely based on that mindset, we have to really develop a sort of sustainable, balanced security structure to make sure that all of us are benefiting from that. I think that will be the takeaway. But definitely, at this moment, council members, including the general membership, may have different views. But we have to reflect, just like what President Xi has proposed in his Global Development Initiative. We need to come up with a set of ideas. I think that initiative really has pointed to the right direction with the right solution. But of course, we are mainly through today's meeting collecting valuable, constructive thoughts, collecting wisdoms from all perspectives. I sincerely hope that members of the Council will adopt a more broad perspective on this issue, instead of simply focusing on the specific ones, on the specific differences. So that's the idea behind the initiative.
It's been pretty tense lately. Fair to say it's been a tense environment in there lately.
Yes, indeed. But definitely, in the Chinese language, crisis and opportunity is the same phrase, half. So whenever you have a crisis, you may see also the opportunity to end the crisis and then to make the world better, to make your situation better. So let's try our best to reflect from the current crisis and then to see really a better world for all of us, a shared world, a common future with common, as I said, common security and a common development. That's what I wish to say.
I have a particular question. Since this council meeting is talking about international security and say stability, any comments on the killing of the daughter of Alexander Dugin of Russia?
Well, I have noted the media coverage on that. I'm really very much concerned about the happening of such tragic events, but I will definitely continue to watch, to hope that through investigations and then we know what happened. Yeah. Definitely such attacks is in nobody's interest at this critical moment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I haven't seen anyone either. 我宣布，安全理事会第9112次会议现在开始。 本次会议的临时议程是维护国际和平与安全，加强对话合作，维护共同安全。议程通过。按照安理会暂行议事规则第39条，我邀请不扩散核武器条约缔约国第10次审议大会主席斯劳维宁先生阁下参加本次会议。就这样决定。安理会现在开始审议议程项目2。我仅提醒安理会成员注意 S2022-617 号文件，即2022年8月12日中国常驻联合国代表给联合国秘书长的信，其中附有关于本项目的概念文件。正如信中所说，安理会成立的初衷是实现所有人的共同安全，维护国际和平与安全也是联合国的常规议题。近年来，这一常规议题显得越来越紧迫，安全困局越来越难解。政局动荡、军事冲突、恐怖威胁、新冠疫情、自然灾害等能源、粮食危机等等安全挑战复杂交织，世界远不太平。似乎每个国家都在为实现自身安全而努力，结果却是各国的不安全感都在上升。面对新的形势，安理会有必要重温初心使命，更好地回应各方期待，更好地履行维护国际和平与安全的责任。这在当前背景下具有十分重要的现实意义。今天的公开会主题定为加强对话合作，维护共同安全，目的就是希望各方通过冷静和理性的对话，对涉及国际安全的根本性问题做一些深入的思考。我们到底需要什么样的国际安全？当前形势下，怎样才能走出冲突动荡，避免更大规模的安全灾难？联合国能够发挥什么样的作用？我期待大家以前瞻性的视野和负责任的态度，聚焦今天的会议主题，并贡献真知灼见。我现在荣幸地请联合国秘书长古特雷斯先生阁下发言。
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you, Mr. President, for convening the Council on this essential topic. Our collective security demands that we seize every moment to forge a common understanding of the threats and challenges before us, and most importantly, to shape united responses to them. As the focus of this briefing makes clear, the path to peace is forged by dialogue and cooperation. I have just returned from Ukraine, Türkiye and Moldova, and I look forward to speaking further about this visit on Wednesday. There, I saw the Black Sea Grain Initiative in action, an initiative to get grain and other vital food supplies moving again through Ukrainian ports. In parallel, we have an agreement to facilitate unimpeded access to global markets for food and fertilizers originating from the Russian Federation. Mr. President, this comprehensive plan is crucial for the world's most vulnerable people and countries who are desperately counting on these food supplies. Above all, it is a concrete example of how dialogue and cooperation can deliver hope, even in the midst of conflict. The same commitment to dialogue and results must be applied to the critical situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I reaffirm that the United Nations has in Ukraine the logistics and security capacities to support a mission of the International Atomic Energy Agency from Kyiv to Zaporizhia. And we continue the relentless search for peace in Ukraine and across the globe in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. Mr. President, this Council represents a vital part of the process of peace and prevention through resolutions to cease conflicts, support reconciliation, and provide humanitarian assistance and support to millions of people in need. But, Mr. President, today's collective security system is being tested like never before. Our world is riven by geopolitical divides, conflicts, and instability. From military coups to interstate conflicts, invasions, and wars that stretch on year after year. Lingering differences between the world's great powers, including at this Council, continue to limit our ability to collectively respond. Humanitarian assistance is stretched to the breaking point, and human rights and the rule of law are under assault. Trust is in short supply. Many of the systems established decades ago are now facing challenges that were unimaginable to our predecessors: cyber warfare, terrorism, and lethal autonomous weapons. And the nuclear risk has climbed to its highest point in decades. Mr. President, the tools that have kept us from catastrophic world war are more important than ever. But they must be fit for today's rapidly deteriorating international peace and security environment. We need to reforge a global consensus around the cooperation required to ensure collective security, including the work of the United Nations. And that is also the driving force behind my proposal for a new agenda for peace contained in the report on our common agenda. Through it, we are exploring the diplomatic toolbox of the UN Charter to end conflicts, especially Chapter 6 provisions around negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. But we are also putting a focus on prevention and peace building. This including strengthening our foresight of future threats and anticipating flashpoints and long-standing conditions that could explode into violence. It includes exploring new and expanded roles for regional actors and groups, particularly as cross-border threats to peace and security emerge. It includes putting human rights first in political and financial investments that can address the root causes of conflict, from social protection and education to programming to end violence and discrimination and increase women's participation across civic and political life. It includes the capacity of establishing new social contracts that build and strengthen the bonds of trust between people who inhabit the same borders, and in the governments and institutions representing them, so all people can lend their hands to building peace. And it includes joint efforts to gather countries around the need to reduce risks stemming from cyber warfare and lethal autonomous weapons. And it includes accelerating efforts to eliminate the nuclear threat once and for all. The 10th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons meeting these months must demonstrate that progress is possible. I renew my call to all states parties to demonstrate flexibility and the willingness to compromise across all negotiations. And countries with nuclear weapons must commit to the no first use of those weapons. They must also assure states that do not have nuclear weapons that they will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against them, and be transparent throughout. Nuclear saber-rattling must stop. We need all states to recommit to a world free of nuclear weapons and to spare no effort to come to the negotiating table to ease tensions and end the nuclear arms race once and for all. Monsieur le Président, l'avenir de l'humanité est aujourd'hui entre nos mains. En cette période de risque maximal pour notre monde, il est temps de renouveler notre engagement envers la Charte des Nations Unies et les idéaux qu'elle représente. La meilleure solution pour tenir la promesse de la Charte de préserver les générations futures du fléau de la guerre, c'est de remplacer la division par le dialogue et la diplomatie, de négocier, de trouver des compromis et de rendre des comptes à l'avenir. Ce Conseil et cette organisation représentent les nations du monde entier et constituent le meilleur espoir de l'humanité pour bâtir un avenir meilleur et plus pacifique. Alors que nous élaborons notre nouvel agenda pour la paix, à nous de prouver que nous avons tiré les leçons du passé. Réitérons notre engagement envers les instruments éternels de la paix, le dialogue, la diplomatie et la confiance mutuelle. Je vous remercie.
感谢秘书长先生刚才所得的通报，感谢他所贡献的思考和建议。我现在请施劳维宁先生阁下发言。
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, allow me to start by thanking you, Mr. President, for the invitation to speak today on such an important topic. For the last 3 weeks, just across the hallway, the state parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons have been engaging in an in-depth discussion on how to strengthen that essential instrument of our common security. I'm aware that not all members of this Council are parties to the NPT. Nevertheless, it is my hope that all Council members could appreciate the important role played by the Treaty as a contribution for the betterment of the international security environment. Since its entry into force in 1970, the NPT has proven to be a bulwark of international peace and security, and a key facilitator of the benefits of nuclear energy and nuclear applications. Over its 52-year history, the treaty has proven itself remarkably resilient and adaptable. Its near universal membership speaks for itself. States parties' current engagement on discussions speaks volumes about the conference's status as the de facto multilateral negotiating forum on all things related to nuclear weapons. As a consequence of the geopolitical turmoil rocking our world since February this year, the NPT faces a raft of challenges, the diversity and scope of which are unlike anything that has come before. And still, throughout these 3 weeks, I have witnessed that state parties have come resolved to strengthen the global regime that spans the 3 pillars of the treaty, meaning nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Mr. President, as far as priorities go, the implementation of the treaty's provisions is front and center for many, if not most, of the state parties. Ensuring fulfillment of the treaty's core commitments and obligations is seen as essential to the treaty's enduring success. For many, this is especially the case for disarmament commitments, nuclear disarmament commitments, including those made at prior review conferences, such as the unequivocal undertaking to eliminate nuclear arsenals. There are few issues more vital to our common security than preventing any use of nuclear weapons. And as many believe, the only way to completely eliminate the risk of a nuclear weapon being used again is to completely eliminate those weapons. This is the crux of the issues that the NPT states parties are grappling with. How to reinforce the 7-decade-old non-use of nuclear weapons, and to take urgently needed steps towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Whether state parties can make progress and strengthen the implementation of all 3 of the NPT's pillars depends on agreement on several key areas, in my view. First, given current global conditions and recent events, it should be no surprise that concerns have only grown regarding the need for urgent action under Pillar 1 of the treaty, nuclear disarmament. Such measures are needed to reverse dangerous trends, increase confidence, and ensure that mistakes or miscalculations do not lead to escalation and catastrophe. In addition, the current global security environment has revived the narrative that nuclear weapons provide the ultimate security guarantee. This is an extremely damaging narrative and dangerous for non-proliferation, especially when coupled with other challenges to non-proliferation, such as hedging and emerging technology that can lower the barriers to the acquisition of nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles. Second, on near-term measures to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons. The norm against the use of nuclear weapons is one of the most important achievements of the post-World War II era, but it is increasingly threatened. The heightened nuclear risk has, on the other hand, strengthened calls for immediate risk reduction measures, and on the other, been taken by many as further evidence for the urgent need to accelerate nuclear disarmament. It has also brought back to the fore questions about how to strengthen security assurances, a long-standing concern of non-nuclear weapon states, that will now be front and center in our minds. Risk reduction remains a priority for many, as I said, especially at the intersection between nuclear weapons and new domains in cyber and outer space, and with new technologies from artificial intelligence to hypersonic weapons. But for many others, they have argued that risk reduction is not enough. They believe that circumstances demand immediate action on irreversible and verifiable nuclear disarmament. These will likely include calls for a strong language on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, as well as new agreements to reduce the global number of nuclear weapons and arsenals. Third, how to support the resolution of regional proliferation crises, especially in Asia and the Middle East. There is broad agreement about the need to strengthen the non-proliferation regime against an array of emerging challenges. Assisting the resolution of regional proliferation challenges, therefore, remains a high priority for state parties. From the Middle East to Northeast Asia, the introduction of nuclear weapons into any regional conflicts will amplify the danger by an order of magnitude. State parties are all too aware that failure to address these cases weakens the entire non-proliferation regime. Fourth, how to broaden access to the benefits of peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. The NPT has proven to be a facilitator of the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology, the benefits of which continue to grow. This nexus between development and security adds a new dimension to the treaty, one that reflects its continued centrality in the international system. And as the role of nuclear technology becomes more and more prominent in areas from agriculture to medicine, ensuring the widest possible reach of those benefits becomes increasingly important, especially as a catalyst for fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. Fifth and finally, how to ensure the safety and security of nuclear power plants in conflict zones. Recent events have focused attention on these issues as the world has been forced to confront, for the first time, the challenges posed by nuclear safety and security in a zone of armed conflict. Mr. President, the review conference is a unique opportunity to strengthen an instrument of common security in a forum of dialogue and cooperation. It is not something that should be squandered. When we talk about the need to find common ground, I think we forget that the NPT is common ground. Protecting it, keeping it fit for purpose, and making sure it can continue its role as a bastion of international peace and security is and must be a priority for all. For more than 50 years, the NPT has proven itself to be an essential and adaptable element of every state party's security. This is why, and despite the current circumstances, I have made all efforts during this review conference and before that, and I will continue to do it until we arrive at the end of this process this Friday, to promote dialogue and cooperation among state parties as the main foundations of negotiations. And I believe it is essential to stress the importance to focus on the elements that unite us and not the ones that divide us. And we need flexibility and political will to negotiate in good faith, to support an outcome from the review conference that ensures the NPT remains fit for purpose in these turbulent and troubling times, and in turn strengthening our common security. Thank you.
我感谢施劳威宁先生阁下刚才所做的通报。下面我邀请安理会成员发言，首先请阿联酋代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to first thank China for organizing this important meeting and to express our gratitude to the Secretary General and to Mr. Gustavo Slavinen for their invaluable briefings. Mr. President, a press item covering the 1945 San Francisco Conference reported that the delegates had signed, and I quote, "a charter written for a world of power, tempered by little reason." The architects of the United Nations needed only to look around them for insight into the ruin wrought by unrestrained power. The story of short-sighted ideological and hegemonic pursuits had echoed across human history, each time with greater dissonance. So in an act of necessary but extraordinary ambition, they committed to building something better. They envisioned an international order in which people express their right to self-determination through equally sovereign states that resolve their differences with dialogue and without the threat of wars of aggression. They sought to temper power by binding together in common security and prosperity those who may wield it and those who may suffer it. Since then, with pragmatism, creativity, and leadership, and despite many challenges to these lofty ideals, the system has held. This achievement in itself should give us some comfort in this moment of rising polarization and fragmentation. As the bold vision of an open, cooperative, and inclusive world order is vindicated by the scale of our global challenges, we cannot entertain abandoning it, whether through revisionism or retrenchment. Instead, the UAE firmly believes that this must be a moment of renewal for the international system. Our cooperation is necessary if we are indeed to address the world's most urgent threats, and the crises on this Council's agenda will not relent in their demands for our collective efforts. As we grow ever more reliant on each other, our first and only truly global multilateral system is still our last best hope. However, it cannot remain frozen in time. It must adapt to a world with more countries, an increasingly diverse set of influential actors, a shifting balance of power, an expanding role for regional institutions, and the growing risk of tensions between major powers. And it is to the credit of this inclusive system that it now relies on a much wider circle of members and stakeholders than it did at its creation. These include some 80 countries that secured independence during decolonization, as well as the engagement of private sector and philanthropic actors and local and global networks of youth and women and civil society. But to fully reap the benefits of that progress, institutional responsibility must also expand. For example, for a long time, the multilateral system has been divided between the so-called norm makers and takers. However, wider ownership of the system could ensure greater investment in its success. Countries historically limited to merely norm-taking have the capacity to play a more active role in setting and upholding the agenda. Collectively, we must fashion a more inclusive system of norm-setting and decision-making to allow the views of all to shape our inextricably bound future. And in doing so, as others have said, we must be pragmatic, incremental, and results-oriented. We should prioritize those common challenges that genuinely concern all of us and that can only be resolved if we work together. Climate change, pandemics, food and water insecurity, poverty, gender inequality, energy supply, terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We should actively seek out our partnerships, especially with those with whom we may not always agree. We cannot sacrifice crucial agreement for complete agreement. Broadening responsibility also means systematically empowering regional organizations to solve regional problems. They're often better placed to find sustainable solutions as they bring the nuanced understanding and the greater willingness to compromise. And the Council should creatively and intentionally leverage the tools at its disposal to support those organizations and reinforce their efforts with the financial support needed for those changes and not only paying it lip service. More than anything, this is a time and a place for determined leadership. The issues on our agenda are not zero-sum games. In the long term, cooperation leads to better outcomes for all. But self-interest begets self-interest, and that must inform the efforts to reverse its corrosive effects. We need this leadership that can overcome the binary approach to coalition building. The us versus them lens may clarify current divides, but at the risk of obscuring the urgency of longer-term challenges. Mr. President, we all have a stake in the preservation and success of the multilateral system, but the stakes are clearly not equal for some, including those caught in geostrategic crossfire. What is at stake is their very survival. Cognizant of that fact, the most effective of our predecessors in these chairs tried to manage their differences and disagreements in a way that allows the UN to remain responsive to those who need it the most. The world looks to this chamber to summon that spirit once again and, in the process, usher in the necessary renewal of an open, cooperative and inclusive world order. Thank you, Mr. President, for this timely discussion.
我感谢阿联酋代表的发言，下面请巴西代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank China for convening this briefing and the Secretary General for his important remarks. I would also like to thank Ambassador Gustavo Slauvinen for his insightful intervention. While it is important to clarify that the decisions regarding the NPT review process are the exclusive and collective competence of the states parties to the treaty, the fact that, for the first time, the president of an ongoing RevCon briefs the Security Council in an official meeting is a positive sign. It shows that the body, which bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is attentive to the main multilateral discussions taking place beyond the walls of this chamber. Ambassador, you can rest assured of Brazil's full support for your efforts to reach a balanced, meaningful, consensual outcome document for the conference. Brazil is convinced that we are in the best hands to lead the way. Mr. President, we need to take certain steps for achieving a safer and more peaceful world. First, we need to overcome, once and for all, the false narrative that nuclear weapons make the world a safer place. In reality, such weapons spawn an elusive and precarious security. Their mere existence invites further proliferation, undermines global stability, and compromises international security, putting the whole world at existential risk. The substantial increase in nuclear tensions since the beginning of this year is a powerful demonstration of this fact. As we kickstart the final week of the NPT RevCon, we cannot lose sight of our common objective of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament is not a concession on the part of nuclear weapon states. It is an unequivocal commitment and a binding obligation in accordance with Article 6 of the NPT. While nuclear risk reduction measures are important and necessary, They are by no means a panacea for our atomic malady, let alone a substitute for nuclear disarmament. We must always keep in mind the fragile balance between the three pillars that allowed for the adoption of the NPT. This balance is the only way to ensure that the treaty can remain relevant. Second, prevention is a better cure, as conventional wisdom reminds us. The international community should make more frequent use of preventive diplomacy and mediation. It should focus more on Chapter 6 than Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It should condemn the abusive use of Article 51. The law of action and reaction is especially applicable to the use of force, which tends to generate further use of force in a chain reaction. Insisting on the peaceful settlement of disputes is the only way to get out of this vicious circle. Third, there can be no stability where the rule of law does not prevail. Respect for international law is crucial for peaceful international relations. International law is the language we must speak when differences arise among us. International humanitarian law protects us from further damage when conflict regrettably breaks out. International human rights law and international refugee law, by protecting individual rights and thus saving lives, may avoid trauma and resentment, which are among the root causes of conflict, and they are key for any reconciliation process. Fourth, it is of paramount importance to acknowledge the strong and reinforcing relationship between peace and economic and social development. There can be no development without peace, and no lasting peace without development. A new agenda for peace will only be successful if it has its foundations on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. A strong economic foundation and robust productive capacities are the path to job and wealth creation, solid fiscal revenues, debt sustainability, political and social stability, and ultimately peace. Strengthening international cooperation, investing in productive capacities, and combating poverty and hunger must remain at the heart of our deliberations in this organization. In addition, we must not forget that developing countries are manifestly underrepresented in peace and security decisions. There is a pressing need to move forward the discussions on the Council's reform, and we invite all Member States to constructively engage in the intergovernmental negotiations. Fifth, durable peace requires comprehensive approaches that could benefit significantly from the support of the Peace-Building Commission. The PBC is well suited to work as a platform to promote greater coordination among relevant partners of a particular country at risk of lapsing or relapsing into conflict. Additionally, it can mobilize regional organizations and international financial institutions and foster South-South and triangular cooperation arrangements in support of national peace-building initiatives. The Commission can also support the implementation of peace-building activities by peacekeeping operations and to help mobilize political support to promote reconciliation, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, institution building, and other nationally defined peace-building priorities. Mr. President, this briefing brings about a timely discussion. We look around and we see war, conflict, terrorism, pandemic, and poverty. The fear of nuclear devastation looms at our doors, and this fear is currently heightened. As the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute pointed out, interstate conflict has been on the rise. Wars and ill-devised sanction regimes disrupt supply chains, spread scarcity, raise inflation, result in food insecurity, and ultimately affect in a disproportionate way those most in need. There are myriad factors that we can point to as causes of international instability and insecurity. As this Council has recognized, sustainable peace can only be achieved by promoting security and development. We need comprehensive approaches that integrate political, security, development, human rights, and rule of law activities and address the underlying causes of each conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
And more just world. But success requires good faith. It means not just quoting the UN Charter, but actually abiding by its principles in practice. And it requires us to hold member states accountable vigorously and consistently when they violate the Charter and the principles it stands for. Unfortunately, one of the greatest threats to our success to maintain peace and security is from within. At the top of the list is the full-scale invasion by Russia, a permanent member of this Council, of its sovereign neighbor and fellow UN member state, Ukraine. Before Russia's unprovoked invasion, the United States, Ukraine, and its neighbors, as well as other member states, undertook intensive diplomatic efforts to dissuade Russia from choosing a path of force and violence. We convened dialogues at high levels across a range of international venues, including in this Council, to voice concerns about the security situation and to discuss potential measures to revitalize Europe's security architecture. Russia, however, rejected dialogue, discarded established views of sovereign equality, discarded the concept of indivisibility of security, and launched an horrific war. Russia has justified its actions by attempting to redefine basic concepts like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the indivisibility of security. It has done so by asserting that it is Moscow's prerogative to dictate the political and security choices of its neighbors. You know, Russia is fond of saying that the security of one state cannot come at the expense of others. But Russia's tortured, full-throated messaging on the supposed threats it faces from its neighbors omits the fact that all nations have the right to choose their security alliances. Russia's interpretation of indivisible security does not justify one country's attempted annexation of another. This goes against not only the principles, but the explicit words of the UN Charter and its allowances for mutual self-defense arrangements. Russia's selfish desire to invade its neighbor and steal its land has had implications for us all. It has exacerbated global food insecurity. It has launched a new refugee crisis. It has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians. And it has degraded the bedrock principles that have prevented new world wars. The greatest mistakes of the 20th century came from the age of empires, when countries and people were not free to make their own sovereign determinations about their societies, economies, partnerships, and alliances. We cannot make those mistakes again. That is why we enshrine these lessons in documents like the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By protecting and promoting human rights, we protect what bonds us together, our shared humanity. That is why states cannot excuse their human rights violations under the guise of domestic internal affairs. Universal rights are and must be just that, universal. The language in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could not be clearer. And finally, we came away from the 20th century in agreement that existential threats like nuclear proliferation needed to be monitored together, that we should use the key part of our cooperation that must continue. We are ready to negotiate expeditiously a framework to replace New START in pursuit of further bilateral strategic nuclear arms reductions with Russia. We're prepared to work with all countries on risk reduction and strategic stability efforts, and we will continue to support the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And we're eager to begin working with partners to restart negotiations this year on the long-delayed fissile material cutoff treaty. These global challenges require global solutions. They require good faith and adherence to established norms and international law. They require commitment and perseverance, which too often are in short supply. But we have to persist because our collective security hangs in the balance. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢。下面请英国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the Secretary-General and Ambassador Slovenen for their important briefings today. Mr. President, dialogue and cooperation are essential components for settling disputes and building peace and security. In this Council, we have seen some significant positive examples in recent months. In Yemen, sustained efforts, including Council members and regional actors, have brought us to a fragile truce. On Somalia, cooperation within the Council and with the AU led to the establishment of a new mission, ATMIS. But dialogue can only ensure our collective security if it is matched and underpinned by states upholding the international system that keeps us all safe. This must start with the Charter as the guarantor of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Today, there's no contest for the gravest threat to the system of common security enshrined in the United Nations. Russia, a permanent member of this Council, has torn up the Charter and trampled on the rules that underpin international peace and security. This undermines the entire system we are all here to uphold. To ensure all of our security and the system we rely on, we must hold to account states that transgress universally accepted norms.
谢谢。下面请挪威代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General and Ambassador Slovenen for their informative briefings, and we thank China for convening this very timely meeting. The world is currently facing a multitude of immediate challenges in new and reinforcing ways, from the pandemics to climate-related conflicts, cybercrime, food insecurity, and a growing number of refugees. Conflicts have become increasingly protracted, with devastating effects on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Lack of protection fuels conflicts and is a threat to international peace and security. No state, no matter how powerful, can resolve all these challenges alone. Multilateralism must be at the heart of how we seek to deal with our global challenges. President, we need to take a more active role in preventing crisis. We therefore highly value that the Secretary-General has made prevention a priority in his report, Our Common Agenda, emphasizing the need to ensure that financing is adequate, predictable, and sustained. In searching for ways to facilitate early responses, we also need to improve the Council's situational awareness. Here, there is a key role for the Secretariat and UN briefers to use their interactions with the Council to bring emerging issues to its attention and sound the alarm. Working together with regional organizations such as the African Union is essential for the Council to understand and tackle emerging security threats, including the rise of non-state actors in conflict. In order to reach sustainable peace, Norway also strongly believes that we need to talk to all actors involved in any conflict. The full and meaningful inclusion of women is crucial in this regard. President, great power rivalry is putting pressure on the multilateral disarmament architecture. New weapon systems are being developed and deployed. Proliferation challenges are on the rise. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has helped to safeguard global security for more than half a century. It is the cornerstone of our efforts to rid the world of nuclear weapons. It is essential that we seize the opportunity during the ongoing review conference to reaffirm our commitment to the treaty. We would also strongly advocate the entry into force of the CTBT. We must persist in our efforts to prepare the ground for future binding arms control and disarmament agreements. In this regard, we emphasize to use the gender lens also on this work. Women and women's organizations are central actors in policy and advocacy on non-proliferation and disarmament. President, the UN Charter clearly prohibits aggression and acquisition of territory by force. Russia must immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and cease all threats and military actions. The recent shelling on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of special concern. President, let me conclude with a concern we share with many around this table. The world currently faces unprecedented levels of acute food insecurity. Rising food prices are driving hunger in South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and other places. It is affecting livelihoods and multiplying the risk of further conflicts and instability. Russia's war on Ukraine has worsened the situation further with serious global impact. Norway commends the Secretary-General for his contribution to the initiative on the safe transportation of grain from Ukrainian ports through the Black Sea. This is an important step and can prove to ease global food insecurity. President, the challenges we're facing require a holistic and inclusive response. We are all affected. Our efforts for collective security must be coordinated across all three pillars of the UN's work: peace and security, human rights, and development. I thank you.
谢谢。下面请加纳代表发言。
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the Chinese delegation for organizing this important meeting to promote common security through dialogue and cooperation. We also thank the Secretary General for the depth and clarity of his statement, as well as Ambassador Gustavo Slovenen, President of the 10th Review Conference of the NPT, for his insightful briefing. 7 decades after the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, the world is increasingly witnessing strains to the structures of the global order, not only because there are new and emerging global threats whose resolution require effective national actions, but also because distance in time from the brutal images of the wars of the past, countries are beginning to consider ever more readily the threat of and use of force as an instrument for pursuing policies in the international arena. For many smaller countries, while there is an awareness that the rules-based order has not always been fair, the affirmation of the order is nonetheless firm, as it remains the key necessity in holding the stability of the modern international system. Most of us are only too well aware of the acute risk of a Hobbesian imagery if the international system of governance we have built in the post-war era should be fragilely maintained. As we therefore reflect over prevailing risks to the global system from threats such as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the risk of nuclear conflict, or its use by terrorist groups, terrorism, violent conflicts, pandemics, climate change, cyber attacks, disinformation, the migration crisis, and food and energy insecurity, we must be resolved to work our respective commitments to the Charter, as well as to the other commitments that we have made, including more recently in the declaration of the 75th anniversary. Mr. President, in considering how we can promote common security through dialogue and cooperation, Ghana seeks to share 5 main points. Firstly, as an overarching requirement, we must collectively work towards the strengthening of multilateralism in ways that make it to serve the needs of all and not the wishes of the few that are powerful or influential. The dialogue required for sustaining multilateralism must therefore change, and outcomes of decisions must reflect the common aspirations of all member states and be based, among others, on principles such as solidarity. In our mind, a strong multilateral system that upholds fairness and justice remains necessary in pursuing the common goal of maintaining global peace and security. Secondly, there have been far too many derogations in the obligation of some member states in relation to their own declaration at the point of joining the United Nations to accept the obligations of the Charter, especially as it relates to the purposes and principles. When this has happened with more powerful states, the organization has been constrained from acting. We therefore believe that in the present circumstances, it may be necessary to initiate a consensual process for member states to formally recommit to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, especially its key purpose, which is to ensure international peace and security, based on the pacific settlement of disputes, the non-use of force in international relations except under very limited and defined conditions, the development of friendly relations, and the pursuit of international cooperation in resolving international problems. Thirdly, while the development of friendly relations among member states was envisaged as one of the key tools in advancing the Pacific world order, we are only too aware of past actions that have been carried out by some states that undermine the territorial integrity and political independence of other states. Such actions create mistrust and weaken the common security we all seek. It is important to recognize that while more powerful states may have extensive security concerns, those concerns cannot by any stretch be subordinated to the domestic interests of other states, no matter how small they may be. This is the requirement of the principle of sovereign equality of states, and this is a principle necessary to be safeguarded in practice if we seek a more stable world. We therefore encourage deliberate diplomatic actions consistent with the diplomatic convention to build mutual trust, including by emphasizing dialogue in order to objectively assess the strategic intentions of countries and obtain a clearer understanding of national policy objectives and strategies. This is critical for dealing with misjudgments and avoiding unhealthy competition, especially among major powers. Fourthly, in the midst of prevailing geopolitical rivalries, the elevated risk over the deliberate or accidental use of nuclear weapons are a strong concern that the nuclear weapons states should cooperate to resolve. While nuclear non-proliferation is an important agenda that we must continue to work on, whether on the Korean Peninsula, in the Middle East, or elsewhere, the fundamental concern is that the idea of nuclear weapon itself is objectionable to humanity, and we should therefore work assiduously towards achieving a nuclear weapon-free world. This demand requires us to strengthen dialogue and cooperation so that the successes that have been achieved so far, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has helped to manage non-proliferation for 52 years, even though challenges still remain, and the 25 years moratorium on nuclear testing can be built upon. Finally, there are many situations of conflict, especially in parts of the African continent, where small arms and light weapons in the hands of terrorist and violent extremist groups have in effect been wielded as weapons of mass destruction. Such security threats of our time cannot be left only to regional and national actors to manage. The burden must be shared equitably, and renewed efforts and investments made in interventions that would accelerate progress towards the realization of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. In concluding, Mr. President, Ghana believes that the common security that we are all yearning for is possible and can be achieved. We therefore look forward to the further engagement of Member States on our Common Agenda report, particularly as it relates to the new agenda for peace. While recognizing the importance of regional arrangements in advancing collective security, we also underscore the crucial role of the UN in promoting dialogue and cooperation for our common security, and believe that the equal platform provided by the United Nations enables states to develop common understandings on the application of international law and norms, rules, and principles for responsible state behavior. We need to jealously guard this multilateral platform. I thank you, Mr. President.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.